Ladies
and gentlemen, colleagues, it's a pleasure to see you here again this Wednesday afternoon. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 71 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry and Technology. Pursuant to the order of reference of Monday, April 17th, 2023, we are studying Bill C-34, an act to amend the Investment Canada Act. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, pursuant to the House order of Thursday, June 23rd, 2022. And today, as witnesses, we have Mr. Patrick Leblond here in person. He's Associate Professor, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, Faculty of Social Sciences, University of Ottawa. Thank you for being here. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And then we have Dr. Ian Lee, Associate Professor, Sprott School of Business, Carleton University by video conference. Welcome, Mr. Lee. And finally, Edmonton Global, we have Malcolm Bruce, who is the CEO, and he's also here by video conference. Thank you.
Mr. Bruce, for joining us this afternoon. And without further ado, I'll let Mr. Leblond start with 5 minutes remarks. The floor is yours.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee, good afternoon. Thank you for this invitation to appear before you to discuss Bill C-34. I'll be speaking in French.
Ask questions in English afterwards. En guise d'ouverture, j'aimerais...
By way of opening, I'd like to discuss three important aspects of the bill. One, the nature of an investment that constitutes a threat to Canada's national security. Two, the penalties for non-compliance with undertakings made by a non-Canadian investor. And three, transparency. Now, let's start with the nature of an investment constituting a threat to Canada's national security. In the bill, the amendment to Section 11, or Clause 11, mentions, which would become paragraph C, refers to a unit operated in whole or in part in Canada that has a place of business in Canada or that has assets in Canada for its operation. The bill refers to significant assets and significant technical information that is not publicly available. The question I have is what happens if the same non-Canadian investor acquires the same material assets or technical information directly without acquiring the unit in question that owns them, these assets or this information. For instance, what if the investor buys a bank of personal data on Canadians or the source code of an algorithm for a critical infrastructure application? Is the investor required to file a notice in the manner contemplated by the bill? Is the acquisition covered by the bill? If the answer is no, there's a risk that an investor wishing to use such assets or technical information for legitimate business purposes may decide to acquire them directly from the Canadian unit that owns them rather than acquiring the unit itself and risking the acquisition being blocked by the minister for reasons of public safety or security. The same logic applies to owners of the Canadian unit who, of course, wish to maximize the sale value of their assets and information. They might choose to put up these assets and information rather than the unit they control. In such a scenario, the threat to national security remains. So if the Investment Canada Act does not cover such a scenario, and the assets and information themselves and not the unit are purchased, then these assets or the purchase of the assets or information must be covered by another law or other laws. But which ones? To my knowledge, there are none. That's my first question. With respect to this bill and given the intangible nature of a number of assets, we're talking about data or technical information, it's easy to acquire them without necessarily acquiring the company that owns them. Now, as to penalties for non-compliance with undertakings given by a non-Canadian investor, the bill provides that the minister may approve an investment if the non-Canadian investor makes certain undertakings to eliminate or reduce the risk of harm to national security. But what happens if the investor does not comply with the undertakings? The bill provides for a penalty of up to $500,000. If this penalty only applies once, that doesn't seem like much to me. Significant assets or technical or technological information could generate millions of dollars in profit. Is $500,000 once paid for? Because in the legislation there's nothing saying that it would be every day or every year. Is that enough, really, to encourage or even compel a non-Canadian investor to comply with these undertakings. Is that not then simply a cost of doing business? My question is this: why not consider a higher penalty like what is provided for in Bill C-27? That bill mentions a penalty of up to 5% of worldwide revenue or $25 million, whichever's higher. So why, in this bill, C-35, are we only talking about this one penalty of $500,000, especially when you reflect on the fact that personal data is so important on the one hand? We're talking millions of dollars in penalties, potentially up to 5% of global revenue, whereas when we're talking about national security, based on the same data, the sanction, the penalty is only $500,000. Does that actually mean that the threat to national security is less important? And that's my question to you. Moreover, what if the investor pays the penalty and continues to breach these undertakings? Does the minister have the power to terminate the investment? Without being a lawyer myself, my reading of the Act and Bill C-34 is that the minister does not appear to have this power, as is the case in the United States. Retroactively, they can do such a thing. Would that not be applicable, or should that not be applicable here? That's what I ask myself as a question. Transparency now. The bill risks increasing uncertainty for non-Canadian investors who want to invest in Canada and for Canadians who want to sell to or finance their businesses in whole or in part through non-Canadians. There's therefore a risk that companies with or believing they have significant assets or significant technical information that's not publicly available will decide to move their headquarters or decision-making center abroad, for instance, particularly to the United States. The greater the uncertainty about the application of the law, the greater this risk of them moving. In order to reduce this uncertainty, there must be some transparency on the part of the minister in his decisions and the commitments made by non-Canadian investors without revealing any state or company secrets. Even if each decision is made on a case-by-case basis, there must be clear guidelines, and these must be respected. Simply providing a list of important assets or important technical information does not seem sufficient to me. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Leblond. Très intéressant. Je passerai maintenant la parole à Monsieur Lee pour 5 minutes. La parole est à vous.
Mr. Lee, you have the floor. 5 minutes.
Oh, Mr. Lee, I believe you're on mute.
My apologies. I keep forgetting. Thank you for inviting me. My disclosures: I don't donate or belong to any political party of any kind. I don't consult to any foreign or domestic corporations, and I have no investments in any corporations of any kind. Please note, I only received the invitation less than 48 hours ago, and I have had insufficient time to provide a more in-depth analysis of the amendments. However, my knowledge and insights concerning private capital investment, including FDI, is grounded in teaching the Strategy Capstone course for 35 years, where capital investment is a very important corporate strategy of the firm. And my experience working for a foreign direct investor in Canada early in my career. So I will focus my comments on FDI by private for-profit corporations with head offices in the OECD and rule of law countries. I will leave the critical issues of FDI and national security to others far more knowledgeable of those issues. Turning to the issue of capital investment, it has been known as long ago as Adam Smith that capital investment in an economy, any economy, is central and critical to the growth of the economy. To state the obvious, firms exist in long-term assets, such as factories, machinery, and equipment that allow the firm to create products and services. To correct an enduring popular urban legend, as we've been taught from Adam Smith to Harvard economist Joseph Schumpeter to Harvard strategy professor Michael Porter, firms do not exist to make a profit. That may come as a shock. Many professors teach that. It's wrong. Firms exist to create something of value, a product or a service wanted and needed by buyers and consumers. If the firm is successful at value creation, the reason why firms exist, and buyers and consumers find the value proposition to be advantageous, they will buy the products or services. And as an outcome of successful value creation, the firm will increase its market share and its revenues and likely its profitability. But the first step in the value creation chain is capital investment. Capital investment and value creation is fundamentally a private strategic decision of investors made by evaluating the gargantuan stream of ever-changing information by the minute in markets. Restated in the language of politicians and public servants, the net benefit is determined by investors willing to take great risks with large amounts of capital and an idea or project that will possibly lead to future value creation success for consumers. Given the remarkable correlation over 300 years of economic history and evidence of private capital investment and relatively high levels of growth, employment, income, and prosperity, evidenced by the astonishing increase in the standard of living in certain countries, what I want to talk about quickly is that the hockey stick of prosperity, of thousands of years of poverty and subsistence, followed by the dramatic gargantuan increases in prosperity, has been documented and analyzed by Professor Deirdre McCloskey at the University of Illinois at Chicago in her book, The Bourgeois Virtues. Given this remarkable empirical record of 300 years of astonishing increase in prosperity, driven by private capital investment and consequent value creation, it seems to me we ought to be encouraging any private capital investment in our economy, subject to my previously stated caveats concerning SOEs and national security. As an aside, I'm in full agreement with Prof. Mintz concerning restrictions on SOEs, or what we in Canada call commercial crown corporations, the existence of which tilts the playing field and allows the state owner of the SOE or the commercial crown to tacitly pick winners and losers rather than competitive forces determining optimal value creation. In very broad strokes, it's reasonable and rational to impose much more rigorous and stringent rules on SOEs and capital investment from countries that do not support the rule of law. But at the same time, I urge the committee to at least reconsider the increasingly burdensome restrictions on private FDI from rule of law countries. The gap between inbound FDI to Canada is falling behind outbound FDI from Canada to the countries. In plain, blunt English, investors with wealth increasingly see better opportunities to invest than inside Canada. Notwithstanding the extraordinary assets and advantages of Canada, investors are voting with their wallet, and I blame our increasingly hostile economic climate in Canada. I'll close on a very personal note about FDI. When I was 17 years old, I very, very foolishly dropped out of high school. And for the next 3 years, I bounced around from one minimum wage job to another in between being unemployed. Then I applied to 2 very large Canadian banks who rejected my absurd job application outright. I then applied to an American finance company operating in Canada that invested a lot of money in Canada to create a financial network. Amazingly, they hired me and trained the dickens out of me how to read an income statement and a balance sheet and evaluate credit and, yes, collect from delinquent customers. And they paid me every 2 weeks in real green Canadian dollars. Members of Parliament, we need more American capital investment, more German FDI, more French FDI, and so forth. Not less, more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lee. I will now cede the floor to Mr. Bruce for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, bon après-midi, tout le monde. I would like to start by acknowledging that I am joining this meeting from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional gathering lands, ceremonial place, and center for trade for many First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit people. My name is Malcolm Bruce, and I'm the CEO of Edmonton Global, the foreign direct investment, attraction, and trade corporation for the Edmonton metropolitan region. The Edmonton region is the 5th largest economy in Canada with $105 billion in GDP, which approximates 1/3 of Alberta's GDP. We have a population of 1.5 million people and are one of the youngest and fastest growing regions in the country. And the purpose of Edmonton Global is to transform and grow the economy of the Edmonton region, and we're focused on attracting investment and helping our regional businesses grow internationally. The conversation this committee has been having is extremely important. As someone who comes from a military background with over 30 years in service, I fully appreciate the need to prioritize Canada's national security. Foreign direct investment can, under certain circumstances, undermine Canada's national security. China is an obvious example. However, bilateral trade with China last year grew by 17%. and they continue to have significant financial stakes, for example, in our energy sector. As we know, we have not have had our best as we know, they may not have had our best interests at heart. We need to be paying close attention to how our economic ties with this country develop, and develop it will for the foreseeable future. We can't be seen as the weak link by our security partners, but neither can we be seen as a weak link in our trade and economic endeavors either. Business leaders across the country recognize that Canada's ability to attract foreign investment is essential to maintaining Canadians' high quality of life. Foreign investment fuels company expansions, increases demand for domestic goods and services, and promotes market choice and competition. These benefit consumers and creates goods, well-paying jobs for Canadians. Foreign investment also supports the development of emerging industries. A good example is the extraction and development of critical minerals in Canada, a national security issue in its own right. One story I'd like to share with you today is about an Edmonton-based company that operates a silica quartz mining operation in Golden, BC. Silica quartz can be refined to silicon metal, an essential mineral for green energy transformation, producing everything from computer chips, EV batteries, solar panel, lightweight alloys, to over 7,000 consumer products. This particular company spent millions of dollars over the years trying to build a foundry in Canada that would be able to refine this material here. But ultimately, they were unable to make it work in Canada. They have since begun construction of that foundry in Tennessee, an investment that will grow to over $1 billion Canadian over time. And we've lost that value-added opportunity related to this vital natural resource. And from a national security and resiliency perspective, we've lost out doubly. All of the silicon material or metal that is being produced will go directly to US companies, including the Department of Energy focused in industries of computer chips, solar panels, and EV batteries. As America prepares itself for future and independence from the global supply chain issues, we may still remain very vulnerable. We need to be paying attention to the resiliency of our supply chains and invest in the infrastructure that will make us less vulnerable to geopolitics and economic shifts. Energy and food security are top of mind for many countries, including our closest allies. Our region is at the forefront of a significant global opportunities in hydrogen and net zero economy, global food security, and the technology that will transform the way we do everything, artificial intelligence. I recently spent some time traveling to South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan to share the opportunities that exist here in our region. There's a lot of interest in what Canada has to offer. They want to invest. We need to ensure they can. From the investment attraction standpoint, what I want to emphasize today is the importance that the investor confidence plays in attracting investment. From friendly investments, we cannot risk lengthy delays in closing transactions or have investors concerned from the steep penalties in the event of an unclear legal requirement. It is my understanding the government is still defining what are the prescribed business activities that will be required for a pre-closing filing. It is imperative that this legislation provide reasonable, predictable, and transparent guidelines for companies exploring investments in Canada. And agencies like Edmonton Global need clear guidance on institutional roles and who within the federal government we can consult with to support provincial investments. I also recommend that the government commit to a timeline for reviewing the amendments after they have been enforced and continue to consult with organizations like ourselves to understand how this legislation is helping or hindering our work. Once again, I'd like to thank the Standing Committee for the opportunity to speak with you today. We appreciate all the work that's going on to protect Canada's national interests. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bruce, and it's us who thank you for taking the time to join us this afternoon. To start the conversation, we'll go to Mr. Perkins for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Those were all great and fascinating opening statements. As a Conservative, it's pretty hard to disagree with any of those statements. Obviously, we need enormous amounts of foreign direct investment to continue to grow our economy. But we have also always had an eye to, regardless of party, to understanding and making sure that those investments are actually in the net benefit of Canada and certainly are within the confines of our interest as well on national security. That's why my questions, first and foremost, given the presentations, would be to Dr. LeBond, if I could. You outlined 3 interesting areas. Some of them actually are in alignment with my second reading speech on this, or a number of other areas. So I'd like to ask you about a few of them, perhaps starting with your first point, which was the nature of investment in national security. And if I heard you right, the first part of that is a concern not just about making sure that we have the appropriate national security reviews when warranted, and I think we're all probably in unison that really needs to happen when it's a state-owned enterprise, particularly from a hostile country, because their interests are not always aligned with ours. But you mentioned the area of essentially assets, tangible and intangible assets that a company may choose to review. I think we've had trouble in the last few years even deciding whether or not we should do national security reviews and net benefit reviews on entire companies in that, and we've got a long list of them from Neolithium on that have not had them. So my question to you was on the asset side, tangible and intangible, what's the impact if some of our critical technology, we've had some of the most inventive blockchain technology, for example, we've heard here, invented here in Toronto, and those are subject to actually not blockchain itself, but we constantly see those. And from my understanding, I don't think the Investment Canada Act has any provisions for review of asset sales, whether that be a mine that an overall company sells, so the company's not being sold, or the mine is being sold, or whether it's an intangible one like a technology or a database. So specifically, what kind of amendment do you think we could make to this bill to make that part of the automatic review process or some sort of threshold of review?
Thank you, Mr. Perkins, for your question. So I'd like to say first that I'm not a lawyer and certainly not a legal expert on the Investment Canada Act, but certainly my reading, as I was reading the Bill C-34, I was surprised with this focus on the unit, right? In French, unité exploitée, which to me kind of refers much more as to the kind of legal entity, if you want, the enterprise, right? And then I was thinking, okay, well, is the enterprise itself the potentially that poses the risk in terms of national security? No, in fact, the bill talks about these important assets, right, or important technical information that are not in the public. And I thought, well, I guess why not? If these are the issues, right, and then if a company says, well, I'm just a foreigner, decides to just buy these assets or these technical information, bypassing the company itself, then do they have an obligation to notify? And it's not clear in terms of my reading, which is why I raised the question. Then, in terms of solution, why not, instead of talking about the unit, right, unité d'exploitation or exploité, why not talk about directly assets and technical information, right? Why not make that the focus in terms of national security? So any foreigner who buys these assets, whether through a company or an enterprise or whatsoever, or on their own, should notify the government. And then it's up to the government to decide whether there is a national security implication or not. And the same for these technical requirements. Why have this kind of intermediate step focusing on the entity itself, which, you could strip it and then say, oh, well, there's nothing there, so transaction goes on and the national security risk remains.
So I would suggest that would apply to net benefit as well, because in some cases that could be not just a security issue, it could be a net benefit issue for Canada. So thank you. On your second point on non-compliance, I agree with you on the fine issue, because it doesn't appear to me that the minister has authority to force a company to divest if they don't meet conditions. I'll give you an example. Nexan was bought by CNOOC, one of our important oil sands players was bought by CNOOC 10 years ago. A number of conditions were put on it by the government of the day, the Harper government. Those conditions were up, and my understanding is that many of them they haven't met. But it doesn't look to me like the Act gives the minister power to actually say, well, you haven't met the conditions, therefore, in the most extreme case, you have to divest yourself of that asset because you didn't meet the conditions. Is that sort of the idea of what you were looking at?
Well, in a way, if yes, in a way, if the idea to, again, that we can ask for commitments to reduce the risk to national security, then the question is, how do we make sure that the foreign investor is actually going to respect those commitments? To me, a $500,000 fine, one shot, kind of doesn't do it, right? And comparing with Bill C-27, where if you don't respect, you don't protect personal data, then you could actually be fined at a minimum $25 million. I'm like, on the one hand, are personal data so much more important than national security? I would argue not. You might say at least they should be equal. So I'm surprised that this same formula doesn't include here. Now, that's one thing. On the other, let's say that a company makes billions of dollars from these assets, these important assets or technical information, and even $25 million, it's nothing, right? So then does the minister have the ability to impose further sanctions, to say, okay, no, you actually have to divest now. Sorry, we gave you X amount of warnings, you can't do it. So I think that the law should be much stronger in terms of holding foreign investors to the commitments that we require of them in the first place.
This fine just becomes a cost of doing business.
And we see it in real estate all the time, right? Where people just, the house burned, pay the $25,000 and then, move on, and, it has no impact.
Right. So. Right. The only other question I wanted to ask you is one of the areas that I covered and we've had a little bit of a discussion on is that asset, that company may be bought by a company that is at the time a net benefit to Canada or seen to be a net benefit to Canada or not a security issue, but subsequently down the line is acquired by, say, a state-owned enterprise from China. And that is a problem. Other G7 countries seem to have the ability to force an unwinding of that transaction if that happens, but the Investment Canada Act doesn't. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I think that anything that is a threat to national security at any time should be possibly under review, right? And certainly if after things change, a technology that was not a worry 10 years ago becomes a worry now for whatever reasons, I think somewhere in our laws, whether it's the Investment Canada Act or something else, shouldn't we have the ability, or shouldn't the minister have the ability to go in and make an assessment ultimately to protect Canada? Obviously, it has to be done with rules and standards and guidelines and some degree of transparency. We don't want some protectionist measures to be adopted in the name of national security. We've experienced that. It's not good for economic well-being. But at the same time, we need all the tools possible in order to protect ourselves. And if it means forcing divestments after the fact because something new came up, I think that ability should be there. Now, the big question is, should it be if it concerns foreign investors? Obviously, it should be in the Investment Canada Act.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Leblond. Monsieur Fillmore.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fillmore, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Chair, and many thanks to the witnesses today. I'd like to direct my questions to Dr. Lee and Mr. Bruce, if I could. Dr. Lee, thank you for the excellent primer on FDI. That was very well received. And Mr. Bruce, thank you for your service. The question I wanted to ask you both is, currently, as I understand it, the review for a net benefit, the net benefit analysis, can take upwards of 75 days to conclude. And some colleagues here in Ottawa have suggested that perhaps Cabinet should be making the final determination at the end of these reviews. I wonder if either of you have any thoughts on whether Cabinet's involvement would extend that 75 days even longer, and if so, what are the implications of a lengthened review? And why don't we? I would ask Mr. Bruce first, and then perhaps Mr. Lee, if you have any thoughts on that.
So I thank you for the question. I think it's a very reasonable one. Ultimately, many large deals in this country take years to make. So adding 75 days to a decision depending on where that fell into the sequence, I would say may not have the sort of detrimental impact that you would think it would have. However, that's on large deals. For smaller deals around technology and things like that, I suggest to you that it may have an impact, because when it comes to intangible assets like the technology sector, many of these deals can move quite quickly and cash will flow quite quickly. So I think it depends on the sector a little bit. And I also think it depends on where that is in the decision cycle, trying to get to a final investment decision. That would be my quick answer.
Thanks very much, Dr. Lee. Oh, you're on mute, Dr. Lee.
I'm going to keep remembering. Sorry. I don't think it's a good idea to politicize these decisions. That's what we see in developing countries like Argentina. I'm not going to use real basket case examples, but countries that have struggled in the last few years to be competitive and to attract foreign investment. When you study, and I do study the data every year from UNCTAD, the World Investment Report, and I'm always struck by the fact that the country that attracts the most FDI in the world is the country that least needs it, and that's the United States. Why does the U.S. attract so much foreign capital? Well, it's seen as more friendly to investment in that country. There's fewer barriers to entry. What this is doing is simply, and I agree with what was just said, that it's what's another few days or 75 days on top of a very elongated process. But that's not going to create the impression amongst foreign investors that this is a good place to do business. If they say, gee whiz, now I got to go through yet more hurdles, more hoops, and at the end of the day, the politicians can step in, and they're unpredictable people, whatever political party, and then they can throw the whole thing out the window. Hey, I can go just across the border and I can do it lickety-split, where those barriers do not exist. And capital is vastly more mobile today than it was even 25 years ago. So I don't think that's a good idea.
Okay, thank you for that. That was, I guess, you answered me on the involvement of cabinet. I would imagine, though, you might think that any lengthening of the time for review would be not in Canada's interest. Is that fair to say? Yeah,
that's right. I mean, we have to make that sharp distinction that I referenced in my notes. I think there's almost two animals in this bill. One's talking about national security, which is really, really important, and others will talk about that. And then we're talking about we want to really put barriers up to protect national security. On the other hand, we want to welcome more private for-profit FDI from countries that are simpatico with Canadian values. So we want to go in two different directions with this same idea of foreign direct investment.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. Bruce, if I could, with your background in security and defense, regarding FDIs, what do you imagine this bill could do to encourage FDI while still maintaining national security is uninjured?
So thank you. I just look at the way the U.S. right now has published a sensitive technology list. So right now, the U.S. has this list of sensitive technologies that they say you cannot get involved with, exporting this or getting foreign direct investment from certain agencies into this type of technologies. We do not. But because the U.S. is our closest trading partner and such an important security partner for us, it would be foolish for anybody in my business to get involved with those kind of exchanges with countries that may be suspect in terms of using it as dual technologies or being able to funnel it in some other purpose. So I think one of the things that I am always cautious of, and it goes back to some of the common themes you've heard from all of us, is that transparency and certainty in process really helps all of us. And so those are the kind of things that I'd be looking for. And just to reinforce that idea about preconditions now that are going to be described in some form of regulation, which are not yet described, you're asking us to look at a bill that hasn't set out those pre-conscribed conditions that we need to really know more about to be able to say whether this is a good thing or a bad thing before we can close an FID. So, and we've got scalable FIDs. So I just think, again, certainty, transparency are so important for investor confidence, and without them, they're not coming here. And it's, if I may finish with, a opportunity lost is not felt by this country, as opposed to, say, a closing of a factory or something, which is more real, more tangible. But we are missing out on tremendous amounts of opportunities coming into this country because of the uncertainty the investor feels about Canada and the regulations that we have. Thank you.
Is there a minute left, or Okay, thank you very much, Chair. So, as you know, in this review process, we have to define prescribed business activities, and there's some question around whether we should define these prescribed business activities in legislation or whether they should be in regulation, for example, through the guidelines for the National Security Review of Investments. Do either of you have any sense where these descriptions should live, these definitions should live? In regulation?
I would be so.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd be so bold as to describe them in the Act themselves. Thanks.
In the Act.
That will certainly make it more transparent, but certainly less flexible at the same time. So I agree with what you just said, but I think it'll be more rigid. And again, you know how long it takes to slow down to amend a bill, and it can take years. And so it will certainly introduce further rigidity in the decision-making process.
Okay, thank you both.
Thank you very much. Monsieur Lemire, la parole est à vous.
Mr. Lemire, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Leblond, when you appeared before our committee in 2020, you asked a question as to making a distinction between what is strategic and what is not. You say that legislation needs to be robust over the long term. It has two purposes: attract foreign investors and businesses, and also ensure national security. Do you get the feeling that this bill is really responding to these questions? Thank you, Mr. Lemire, for your question. My interpretation of the bill is really focused mainly on process rather than content. We just discussed this. As to how to define material assets, we're told there will be a list that will be produced by the department. Should that be in the legislation or not? On that, I share the opinion of Mr. Lee. If it is in legislation, it is rigid. We know that technology evolves quickly. So have regulations, directives, may be preferable to having that actually in the legislation. In this case, the bill to me seems to be very focused on process, as I said, and how to improve the process to make sure that we can better protect national security in the context of investments by non-Canadian firms. For instance, how to produce these notices rather than to have the government decide what is national security, these levels. And then in this case, of course, as I mentioned from the start, and actually in response to a previous question in discussion with Mr. Perkins, the question is, when we talk about these unité exploitée, or in English they say business or entity, it's slightly different than in French. Why not focus specifically on those units, or on the assets rather, or on the information? And on that point, I do have some questions about the bill. How effective can it be if you can circumvent the process by saying, okay, no, I didn't buy this unit or entity. I simply purchased assets, or I simply purchased information. Maybe it's the source code for an app. Maybe not even the app. Maybe the source code alone. In that case, is it the simple fact of making this acquisition that is a threat to national security? I would say yes. That should be mentioned. The other aspect, as was mentioned also, was to say this. How do we make sure that these requirements we make of these foreign investors to reduce risk to national security, if we're not in a position to make sure they are upholding these undertakings because perhaps the penalties are too weak, or because we didn't threaten disinvestment, then does that mean it reduces the effectiveness of this bill? And at the end of the day, the Investment Canada Act's ability to ensure the protection of national security. National security as well as securing supply chains. We know that things have changed internationally since the pandemic, specifically that issue. In your last appearance, there were some discussions as to the Rona transaction. that was now under Lowe's, that asset was sold by Lowe's to an investment fund. At the time of the transaction, Lowe's committed to maintaining its operations centers in Boucherville in Quebec. 4 years later, what were the net benefits to Canada of this sale? The Canada allowed for this sale. I mean, I can't comment on detail here, but we can presume that given how unsuccessful Lowe's was once Rona was purchased, perhaps when it comes to a benefit, one might have some questions as to how beneficial it was. Now, with the purchase by an investment fund, do the same obligations remain? I don't know the details, as I said, so I can't comment as to whether those undertakings taken by Lowe's are still in place under this new investment fund purchase. But these are follow-ups that need to take place. And then, if that's not done, what actually happens? My understanding is that in this type of case, a minister or a department's authority to compel this type of undertaking, well, Lowe's could say, well, we're going under, so we can't keep our word on this. Does that mean that the deal made with the investment fund is, let's forget about these undertakings? Does that happen? It's not so much that Rona is a company that is in a strategic area, but it is really a jewel in the crown of Quebec, if you will. We have to do this ahead of time. It's not really after the fact. You need to do things upstream before things really deteriorate to make sure that those undertakings are respected. Do you feel that this current bill allows us to push more in that regard? Based on my reading of this, and of course, again, I'm an economist, focus on, I'm not a lawyer, I'm public administration and the rest, but I would say no. At least it's not clear to my understanding of this bill on Investment Canada Act, etc., the minister or the department's authority to go back in time to then threaten and say, we will unwind, we will force you to sell. It's just not there. It should be there. It should be clearly set out, and the economic penalties should be far greater, I believe, than $500,000. In many cases, that's purely symbolic. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire. Mr. Leblond. Mr. Massé, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. And Mr. Lee, I'm glad you raised the issue over investment maybe leaving our country and going to the United States. I think you seem to have been suggesting that it's a lot easier. But I guess I'm going to ask then your assessment. The Committee on Foreign Investment, CFIUS in the United States, actually has 16 departments that actually oversee foreign investment. It was created by Gerald Ford in 1975. And in the 1980s, really emerged significantly dealing with Japanese semiconductor issues and American supplies. And in 1989, the Exxon Florio arrangement gave them the option to actually outright reject mergers or acquisitions. And CFIUS right now does not have to have a public review. It doesn't even have to engage the parties that are looking to take over, and they do not exercise any public commentary of the decisions that they make. So I'm just wondering, given that, are you suggesting that our current laws in this current bill would give us equivalency or stronger powers than CFIUS?
Thank you. I haven't looked at CFIUS, but I want to respond in a slightly different way. Because of the way I've been teaching the strategy course for some 30 years, I've increasingly evolved towards or turned away from theory to, and I'm not putting down theory. Theory is very important, but I'm increasingly evidence-based, saying, let's look at the data. What is the actual data saying? And when you look at the actual FDI flows, so it's not my opinion, it's the actual flows. And C.D. Howe has a wonderful paper out about a year ago called Decapitalization, and they have the comparative metrics normalized to share of GDP for investment, FDI, Canada versus the States. And
go to the other witnesses, because if you don't want to comment on that, I want to get commentary from the other things on CFIUS directly, because I'm trying to look for, and I'm trying not to, I don't want to be rude, I'll try to get back around to it, but I would like to hear from the other witnesses about because this is kind of the comparable sister law that we would have here in Canada. So we're looking at a minister and maybe cabinet and a few other things, and maybe perhaps Mr. Lalonde or Mr. Bruce, if you could provide some commentary. Do you think that, with this amendments that we're looking at, is it how does that compare to the United States? Again, I think my personal opinion is doing the assessment, and what I'm getting from my American colleagues is that they're looking at us and saying, "Are you serious?" So maybe Mr. Lalonde and then over to Mr. Bruce with regards to that, if you could provide something, please.
Thank you, Mr. Rossi. I think certainly where we are at now, and then including this bill, I think the CFIUS process remains much tougher than what we're seeing here and what we have currently in terms of protecting national security. I'm not necessarily saying that I agree with it. I think the fact that it has zero transparency, that it does create uncertainty, is a problem. And I think, in fact, CFIUS has pretty much killed any Chinese investment in the United States as a result of its process. And a lot of and a lot of companies are looking at this and say, do we want to go through this, only to find out that in the end our investments are not going to happen. On the other hand, referring to previous comments, the fact that CFIUS can retroactively force this investment in the name of national security is something that I think is worth considering, right? There's a famous, obviously, now well-known case of Grindr, right? The application for homosexuals to matching application, where they found out that potentially this could, it was bought by a Chinese company and could potentially be abused, where people could be blackmailed, for instance, if they had not come out or things like that, and then retroactively force the sale of the company. Now, you might question the fact that, well, once the data has been transferred, does it really matter if you force the disinvestment? It's kind of too late. Once you have the assets, whether it's the data, whether it's the technical information, disinvestment itself, forcing Grindr to be sold to an American or European or Canadian company, to me, the ship has sailed. It's too late. But at least it's potentially a threat that could be used, especially in the case of commitments that are made, and say, if you're not respecting these commitments. But I think the CFIUS process, it might be in a way too opaque for my liking.
Yeah, no, thanks. I'll go to Mr. Bruce to get in on this. Just if you have an opinion on this, Mr. Bruce. Yeah, no, and the Grindr one was really about limiting damage control, and then also whether or not they later on would get more acquisitions as well too. So, but that's a very good point about that. Mr. Bruce, do you have anything on this?
No, I'm not going to comment any further. I think most of those points have been addressed.
Okay. So if I could go back to Mr. LeBlanc, I do. So you mentioned Rona not being strategic, but when you look at some of the consumer stuff out there, and then we have is there as an economist, I'm just looking at lack of competition as a big issue. So you have Zellers bought by Target. Zellers was making a profit, actually had benefits for the workers and so forth, and Target's now gone. Future Shop is bought by Best Buy, closed up. Stone Canyon and Windsor has bought Windsor Salt. They've also bought an American firm, and now there's the strikes and stuff like that. But Rona and Lowe's, I guess I would argue that in terms of a strategic industry, is that these are consumer products for businesses and consumers that have intrinsic values in our economy. So how do we relate that? So I'm not taking offense to your comment saying it's not strategic, but at the same time I want to challenge that assessment in the sense that lack of competition by losing even consumer products that are connected to small, medium-sized businesses becomes a problematic thing for our economy.
I think my comment in terms of what's strategic and going back to my testimony from 2020 is that, again, it was more in the context of national security, right? A threat to national security. I think what you're referring to is much more the net benefit analysis within the Investment Canada Act, where obviously, to me, you're absolutely right that competition should be part of that analysis, right? Now, whether it is not clear to me. I mean, it's one of the things that is obviously considered or supposed to be considered, but often we don't know what really, that's one of the issues in terms of transparency is often we get the decision, we say, oh, it's a net benefit, but we don't really know how it was reached and what portion competition add into this. And that's why I think in general it'd be nice to have more transparency. Obviously, there are things you don't necessarily want to put out in the public, but then again, maybe parliamentarians should be part of that process and should have some kind of ability to review some of these decisions or at least get the information.
And hence your valid criticism or concern with CFIUS as a response mechanism, although it does include many more departments and the governmental oversight, but still there's a secrecy behind, and you don't really know what the magic formula is, and we don't know what it is in terms of a decision by the minister or, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Massey. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to jump on a lot of the testimony. This is a good discussion with Mr. Massey. Mr. LeBlanc, so do you believe then that as part of the net benefit review, it should involve competition? We should be looking at competition as one of the aspects?
I think we should. I think obviously there's a competition bureau that is, the agency responsible for these things. But I think that if we're looking at a foreign acquisition, competition should be part of the analysis. Certainly it is in some sectors, whether it's the financial sector where, if we had a major international bank or other investors, that would be one of the concerns that we might have. In some cases, it might lead to more competition. Others, it might not. I think it's something, if the idea is to attract investments, but also to stimulate more competition, to create ultimately also more investments, not just foreign ones, but also Canadian ones, right? So I think it's one of the considerations. And as I said, I don't know what the process is. I don't know when there is an investment where on the one side you have the Investment Canada team looking and reviewing a transaction, and on the other you have the Competition Bureau. Do they talk to each other? Do they exchange information? I have no idea.
Well, I want to get into the other thing you were talking about earlier, which was the strategic or the critical technology list that CFIUS would have. And maybe I'll ask this to some of the other witnesses here. In Canada, we seem to have an investment review division that's part of ISED. What CFIUS has is they're multi-agencies. So I think Mr. Massey mentioned about 15 different agencies. They're on their own. I agree we shouldn't have a list that's embedded or baked into legislation because it can take 15 years sometimes to undo that. But is the investment review division sufficient enough? And to any of the witnesses, should this then, instead of just being baked into ISED, should it be across many agencies? I'll start with Mr. LeBlanc.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think so. I think the fact that now, we're not just talking about buying stuff. We're talking about buying sometimes very sophisticated technology.
Just to interrupt, because I think the term you have not said once, but I think you're alluding to it, is intellectual property. So you've talked about data stuff, but the thing that we've studied in other committees we've talked to here is commercializing IP, protecting IP. So we're looking at ICA. Would you agree that it's IP that we're evidently trying to protect for Canada?
Look, I think I'm using in a way the terms that are set in the bill. Obviously, intellectual property covers a lot of ground, right? But I think ultimately what matters is that again, if we're talking about national security, obviously, it should involve, yes, the investment review people, but certainly they should talk to the people at CSIS. They should talk to the people who might be maybe at Global Affairs Canada, who might have certain knowledge about the company or where it comes from and the investors themselves. Maybe then where is that expertise, whether it's in terms of the technology, whether in terms of the person acquiring. Obviously, to me, it should be much more of a whole of government approach, since national security is a whole of government issue. But even on the net benefit, which to me is separate than the national security one, in more and more, it seems that, as I just mentioned, maybe cooperating with the Competition Bureau would be a good idea.
And I think you have some good ideas. And I want to go to Dr. Lee and Mr. Bruce on this too. And one of the big ones too that we also have is FinTrack. So FinTrack is an organization, and again, sometimes they work, but they are different legal entities. They work separately. Dr. Lee and Mr. Bruce, if you can answer that from your perspective as well, real quick, if you can.
I'll be very quick. I guess I have to respectfully disagree with Dr. LeBlanc. I agree on the national security side. I'm not going to go there. But when I hear that you want to start looking now at the protection of Canadian IP and you want to look at the competitiveness, however you're going to measure that in industries that are very, very dynamic, I just want to give a quick, for instance. Last November, I had never heard really of Chat GPT. And now I've decided after a seminar I watched 2 days ago, a 2-hour seminar by Dr. Tony Belletti, Technology Innovation Program. I'm going to spend the entire summer getting up to speed to embed it in my course. This is in the space of 4 months. This is how fast things are moving. And yet the language of various members of the committee suggests that in the commercial sphere, I'm not talking the Chinese or threats to national security, that we can somehow fix it. We say, okay, Rona, you're going to do all these things for the next 5 years, which implicitly suggests there's no change in the markets. The markets are just far, far, far too dynamic. I don't think you can go down that road.
I tend to agree. I think national security, the answer is yes. But I think in everything else, I mean, the reality is 90% of all our businesses are small, medium-sized enterprises, and they're ripe for the taking. And you know, M&A is occurring regularly amongst our technologies, amongst other things. And this is just the reality of the way our ecosystem and the world ecosystem is working right now. So what you need to do is focus on the outcomes that we want to create, and then make sure that this legislation is creating those outcomes that will help us achieve them. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I'll just focus on one last subject I want to talk about, which is just looking at China itself. And obviously we've had testimony, and I'm sure this isn't any surprise, that any company, doesn't matter who it is, operating in China is a state-owned industry, that there's somehow, some way that those companies are all embedded with the state itself. Mr. LeBlanc, would you support that any company that's state-owned, that we do an automatic review?
Well, I think right now, I mean, certainly for a lot of transactions, it is, my understanding is it is automatic. I think, again, depends what the nature of the acquisition is. You know, for instance, a state-owned company that buys a mine where it's in the ground, you can't easily move it outside of Canada. Now, if there is a fear that this Chinese company, state-owned or not, would then take what's in the ground, move it abroad for its own purpose and no benefit to Canada, then again, to me, in this case, it's not so much the type of ownership, is what are the risks, and their, you know, commitments or you know, could be required. I mean, or regulations could be done, right? So to me, I don't want to say it again. We have to look at what are the risks that we're talking about. And in some cases, ownership doesn't matter, really, whether it's a state-owned or not. Should we just talk about China? I'm not sure. I think one has to look at where the government, obviously, in various countries where we might have worries, can access or can gain access that could ultimately threaten, you know, Canada's national security, and that could be part of the economy. You know, we talk about a lot about China and the access to data and all these things, but, you know, we never question the fact that in the United States, the government also has access through the Patriot Act and other things through a lot of the data that companies. And because obviously the U.S. are an ally, we don't really worry about that. But the same kind of access the U.S. government has, and a lot of government, even in democracies, have the same thing. Now, you know, should we be concerned with that? Well, in some cases we have been, right? Where we have said, no, you know, we can't allow this kind of data to go to the U.S. because it has actually hurt Canadians. So I think, again, just saying, oh, well, you know, everything Chinese is bad or everything this is bad, I think we really have to look at what are the risks that we're looking at, right? Is the Chinese acquisition of a piece of land, is that a problem? If so, then why is it a problem, right? That land cannot be easily moved. There's other things like IP can be easily moved, and what would that mean if it were moved from the Canadian economy, right? Or mining is another thing. Critical minerals. Yes, if they are moved and serve only Chinese companies, that could be a problem. But then again, it's not so much about the ownership. It might be more about what, a Canadian company could also sell everything to China because China would pay more, right, in terms of critical minerals. So then maybe we need a separate approach, which is focused on, I don't know, percentage of what comes out of the ground stays in Canada or goes to the US, for instance, for our consumption. The rest you can sell to whoever you want at whatever price you want. So I'm just saying that it's not always a question of ownership, that creates the risk.
Thank you, sir.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Gahir, la parole est à vous.
Mr. Here, you have the floor.
Thank you to the witnesses for appearing before the committee. I'd like to just ask questions to Mr. Bruce and Dr. Lee about the provisions in the Act itself. So in the Act, we know there's an amendment to create a new filing requirement prior to the implementation of investments in prescribed business sectors. Some colleagues, I think, would rather the Act require pre-implementation filing for all investments and not just for key sectors. My personal view is that requiring the investments to undergo this filing would, for all sectors, would create more red tape for investors. On the other hand, a targeted pre-implementation filing measure would achieve the objective of protecting national security while also limiting the economic harm. I just want to get your views on that.
I'm happy to start. The problem is I don't know what those pre-filing conditions will be because they're not been outlined in regulation yet. So, it's really hard to make a qualified answer to the conditions. But to follow on Mr. Lee's point there is that there's anything that we do that's going to add to the regulatory burden of companies trying to invest here will be a disincentive, not an incentive to people. So again, I can't give you a better answer than that because I don't know what those pre-filing conditions are going to be.
So just to interrupt. But would you at least agree that it should be for key sectors and not for all transactions that go through?
Yeah, less is more in this particular case. Yes.
Very quickly, I'll respond to your question you just asked. I'm very skeptical, and I've talked about this before, certainly in my classes for a long time, about this idea of strategic industries. Michael Porter has written about this, and I think he's criticized it quite extensively, as have other economists. Dr. LeBlanc would be very familiar with this. And it's really just a disguise picking winners and losers. If we're worried about certain companies or certain ownership, as Dr. LeBlanc put it, well, fine, then we can develop regulations in that respect. But just saying a blanket industry is, quote, strategic seems to me to be bordering on tipping over into protectionism, which is going to harm the Canadian economy.
So my question again for Mr. Bruce, we know that companies often hold significant value in IP, intangible assets. The interim conditions that are proposed in C-34 would block access to those assets in order to address the risk of national security injury that could arise during the course of the review of that investment. So thereby would reduce the threat to national security, while Canadian businesses can continue to operate with minimal impact and continue to review. Can you talk a little bit more to the committee about the benefit of having these interim conditions and what sorts of interim conditions you'd like to see?
So again, having been in the business of doing business with folks that want to invest in this country, the regulatory environment is a key one, right? So if we are going to lay out conditions that are going to impact, for example, on IP, we need to make sure they're clear and transparent so people understand what those things are going to be when it comes to national security. And also, I think the other comment that has been alluded to is the net benefit agreement as well. I mean, the reality is much of the technology that we're looking at today is going to be able to be used for dual purpose. So I think again, if you're going to be looking at certain sectors, certain technologies, we need to understand. Artificial intelligence, for example, is going to be the defining technology over the next 2 decades. And the question has to be that's not a vertical, it's a horizontal, which means it's going to be integrated in virtually every sector in this country, national defense, right through to health and life science criteria. So how do you actually protect against the use of that in some other form? So I think you're going to have a very challenging set of conditions that if you're going to want to list them all. So I think you've got to look at outcome-based things that are more important, I think, to drive what you're looking for in this legislation.
My last question. Yeah, okay. So we know C-34 will also amend the ICA to allow Canada to share case-specific information with international counterparts. Can you talk to the committee about how this step will facilitate international cooperation and information exchange to potentially address areas where there is common national security threats? Dr. Lay or Mr. Bruce?
I'll defer to Mr. Bruce on that.
I think, again, this is going to be, I think when it comes to an ally, there'll be opportunities to speak with them. But I think the point's been raised that, acts like the Patriot Act are a point of interest for many folks that are looking to access the U.S. market. And they come to Canada to be able to store their data here, but still be able to access the largest market in the world, which is the U.S. So they come to Canada because there's advantages about not being in the U.S. jurisdiction because of things like the Patriot Act. So I think there's got to be there are going to be times when we can share, and there are going to be times when we're not sharing, simply because our own national interests got to take priority over some of our allies, not to mention some of the other folks that were doing it. But I would not do it with China. I would not do it with Taiwan. I would not do it with Thailand or Vietnam, because these types of countries we have agreements with, but they are also largest partner for their own economic well-being are the Chinese. So whenever we're dealing with a third party, we just need to understand where their linkages are in other parts of the world, because that technology could transfer quite quickly.
Great, thank you, and that's why it'll be case by case. Sure, that's my end of my questions.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lemire.
Monsieur le Président, Monsieur Leblond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Leblond, I'd like to address one of the issues. Yes, the acquisition of Quebec and Canadian businesses, but also public calls for tender in strategic sectors that could happen internationally, could have an effect on national security. Let me give you an example. CRSC, which is a Chinese enterprise that is banned in Canada, but is somehow active in Canada, banned in the U.S., but here in Canada. Should the Act not cover these types of things if we want to cover national security? That's a good question. Generally, when we're talking about services or contracts in this way, generally it would be the responsibility of the government that is launching the call for tenders to take into consideration all of these issues that could be a threat to national security. I mean, it could be public, it could be regional as well, not necessarily national. If you take a national call for tender for the renewal of, let's say, a metro, a slice of the metro system in Toronto, for instance, in that case, you have to take into consideration public safety concerns. If, let's say, a Chinese enterprise or another, where you think there might be some risk of, shall we say, close links with the Chinese authorities, and therefore access to critical information on a critical infrastructure, currently it should be covered. But currently it isn't covered under the Investment Canada Act. That remains the responsibility at the end of the day of the government that is launching the call for tender. The question is, would a municipal government or a regional government take into consideration those factors? I don't actually have an answer to that. You'd have to ask them. And then what authority does the federal or the provincial government have to impose this type of criteria in granting of any contract? When you're talking about a subway line, this is, of course, potentially critical infrastructure. Absolutely. As you see fit, Mr. Lemire. I'd like to ask a question of Mr. Lee or Mr. Bruce as to whether they had anything to add to that.
You can go first, Mr. Bruce, but I will add.
Thank you. It's an interesting question because when you think at what international needs are, so in China, they have an aging population. And what they want to do is they want to learn how our senior system, believe it or not, I know many of us in this country believe that it's broken, but in many cases for countries like China who are experiencing a vast aging of their population are looking to Canada for solutions. So one of the ways they learn is to acquire assets that are in this country to figure out how we're actually conducting, independent living, assisted living, and then dementia living all in the same complex. So the Chinese are looking to us for help. And so the question then you have to ask yourself is, they will then continue to provide that service when they acquire that particular facility or those facilities or a company that deliver those facilities. So the question for ourselves is then, is that considered net benefit to Canada? Is it a to security? I would suggest that it's probably not a security threat, but it is going to be a net benefit for Canada because we're helping them solve a problem, which will build good relationships with people that we want to in the Chinese economy.
I'll just add to that very, very quickly. I'm not one of those people that think we should ban all Chinese investment. I hope the Chinese export lots of LNG from Canada so they can reduce their dependence on coal as the #1 emitter of GHG in the world. I'm not going to be unhappy if they're exporting wood or agricultural products because these are products that are not sensitive. I don't think that they're sensitive to national security. But there are industries we know. A moment ago I was dismissive of the idea of strategic industries. I did not say that certain industries aren't of greater risk. I think the issue, and I think both of the other witnesses have mentioned this or focused on this, it's the degree of risk involved in terms of the particular industry or the particular asset that we're discussing. I don't see any risk in exporting agricultural products to China. I hope we could trade a lot more and export a lot more, but there's other industries where we don't want to have any relationship, especially in the high technology realm.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Mr. Massey, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to table a motion with my time, but before that, I just want to note that in Windsor West, we actually had to call the Army in during COVID because the private sector was killing our residents by not providing proper services. And they also had the Salvation Army in as well, too. So it's interesting in terms of I hope we don't teach others the wrong things. With regards to my motion, I'll use my time here so we don't take up witness time. That persistent to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake meetings to study the proposed takeover of HSBC's Canadian division by the Royal Bank of Canada, RBC, which is the largest proposed acquisition in the banking sector since RBC's proposed takeover of the Bank of Montreal was rejected by regulators. And the reason I'm tabling that is that we will have some business coming up and hopefully that we can actually have some discussion on this. The Competition Bureau was asked for further information with regards to this takeover, and it was in the early 1990s that the Bank of Montreal was actually not consumed by a takeover at that time because of regular decisions. And this obviously has significant consequences on consumers and on also small business and medium-sized businesses in particular. So with that, I'll table the motion and leave it for committee for the next date that we have business, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and that's the end of my intervention.
Thank you, Mr. Massey. So I understand you don't require us to vote on your motion at this point. It's just
no, I don't like to ambush discussion. Members at the last minute and so forth, but want to get it. Yeah. Somebody's. I've learned by somebody else's practices.
I only follow the standing order.
Thank you very much. So I understand for the benefit of members that you're not pulling what's called a Brad Viss here in this committee. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr.
Chair. Merci.
Thank you to our witnesses.
This is part of committee business, so I appreciate, Mr. Massey, your motion, and we'll look at it at the first opportunity when we do committee business. We'll now turn to Madame Lapointe for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Is for Mr. Bruce. I'm MP from Sudbury, so critical minerals is very important to our region. And we know that critical minerals presents a significant opportunity for Canada. But if we focus on the minerals only, without developing the infrastructure around it, like refining, processing, mining, innovation, we'll have lost a significant portion of that economic opportunity. I found it interesting in your opening statements when you talked about how we need to ensure that the processing is being done here in Canada. And so I want to ask you, what does the government need to do to ensure that this occurs and that we build that chain here in Canada?
First thing is, if we agree that this is a critical to our national interest, then I think we need to look at the entire value chain and figure out where our friction points are and then mitigate those so that we're able to build them here. And I'll give you another example that's the reason why we want to process material in Canada. So we ship most of our critical minerals out for others to process on our behalf, and there are residual outcomes that come from these processes. And in one case, critical minerals that are processed produce another critical mineral. Maybe 30 tons are produced globally in the world. Yet every single night vision goggle produced globally has this critical mineral in it. Canada could be the main provider of it, but we're not anymore because we ship it all out. So when you talk about national security and national interests, one would think that if we could get the foundries and the value added here, then we're not only becoming a valued ally or exporter, we also are providing great high-paying jobs and all the rest of it for economic benefit to Canada.
Thank you. Mr. Lee, do you want to add to that?
Yes, because pardon me for invoking academic theory from time to time, but Einstein said theory can be very practical. Porter talked about this in his idea of cluster theory, and it's been a huge impact at the United Nations. Developing countries have taken very seriously. The idea that you don't just want to have one company that's very successful, you want to have that constellation of companies in the full value chain system that Mr. Bruce was referring to. I completely agree. Porter argued that the wealthiest countries in the world, Germany, Japan, and US, have more clusters. I mean, Hollywood is a cluster, Silicon Valley is a cluster, banking in New York City is a cluster. So it's not just the bank itself; it's all of the suppliers and Hollywood is the script writers and all the people that win Academy Awards. That's the cluster, and that's what you're referring to. But I don't think it can be where I'm going with this. I don't think we can legislate it. I think what we have to do is create the conditions necessary that is going to encourage companies to come here. What Mr. Bruce said, identify the friction points, because I think we should be, I hope you, the MPs, ask the question, why are they not coming here right now? Why is it that they are going somewhere else? They come here, get the minerals, and ship it out. Well, the first and most obvious question is, why? Given all of our advantages that we do have, yet there's something missing. And that's why we have this capital outflow, which has been documented. More money is flowing out in FDI than is coming into Canada. So people are voting with their feet because there's something that they see that's a remiss or not going in the right direction. And I think we have to zero in on that to fix those problems, or what Mr. Bruce called friction points.
Thank you. Mr. Bruce, you also talked about in your travels across the globe that how investors want to invest in Canada. And I can tell you that I've had that experience too. I attended the Prospectors and Developers Conference in March this year. And it was very clear talking to investors across the world that Canada, they want to invest in Canada. And so you said we need to ensure that they can. So my question is, what do we need to do to be successful on this front?
We need to be providing an enabling framework and not a constraining one. And I say that in all sincerity. The example I cited in my opening remarks, this company tried for 4 years to get through the regulatory process to be able to open a foundry and spent millions of dollars trying to do that. And in the end, he gave up and went down to Tennessee, where he's spending over $1 billion to process raw materials that are coming out of our mines in Canada. And this is just one of a number of issues that we continue to impose on ourselves, this uncertainty, and the fact that we don't get bipartisan agreement on big major national projects that are important to our national security and our national health. So I think there are just things that we could do better as a collaborative to be able to create far better outcomes than what we're achieving. We have all the inputs in the world. all the inputs in the world. And I'll give you an example in the agriculture industry. The Dutch have 4.4 million acres under agricultural things, and they produce about $150 billion of GDP out of their ag sector. Canada, just in the 3 prairie provinces alone, have 78 million acres of arable land. And the total output for Canada's ag sector is about $136 billion. The Dutch do better on their 4.4 million acres than we can do on our entire landmass. So you tell me why we can't do better. And, some of it is we're constraining, not enabling.
My last question is to both Mr. Lee and Mr. Bruce. In your opinion, will this bill help mitigate the potentially harmful foreign investments in critical minerals?
I'll let you answer first, Mr. Lee.
Yes, I think it probably will. I'm saying that with hesitation because it's mixed up in this instance. There's national security mixed up with net benefit. And as I keep saying, these are two very different animals. And the animal I'm much more familiar with is net benefit, which is not the language I use. I talk about sustainable competitive advantage. But sustainable competitive advantage is just the business strategy term for net benefit. So we're just using synonyms for the same phenomenon. There's others here far more versant in national security. But it seems to me that because critical minerals has both, this is making it devilishly complex for you, the legislatures, and I'm very sympathetic to you, but I think this is going to slow it down at a time when we need to speed it up. And it's not just lithium; it's the other critical minerals. I mean, I think there's an increasing world shortage of copper. I mean, copper is the backbone of decarbonization. And the studies I am reading, serious studies, really good international studies, are saying that there's just a huge shortage of copper. So I think that this is going to possibly slow things down.
And my only comment would be, we've got to do better than what we're doing now. So I'm interested in seeing where this goes, but the jury's still out, so to speak.
Yeah.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Lapointe.
Thank you, Madame Lapointe. Mr. Lawrence, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. My questions are with respect to some definition issues and I guess to come regulations. And I would certainly give the government this much grace. This is not an easy area to draft legislation. I think we all have to be aware of that, and would put that at the outset of my comments. But there's a number of definitional issues that I think will cause considerable struggles going forward, and without having the prescribed regulations in front of us will make it even more challenging. Some of the ideas that are, I think, weakly defined include business activities, material assets, amongst others. The other, and I have another definitional issue, but maybe I'll start there and just maybe you can either give me some assurance that no, Mr. Lawrence, this is completely clear, or maybe you could expand upon and if you share on these issues. And I'd welcome any one of the panelists to comment, or all.
Can I jump in on that just very quickly? I'd like to, because Dr. LeBlanc brought this out earlier, and I was really itching to jump in. He brought out something very important that he talked about in his last appearance, and I'm going to use slightly different language to say the same thing. And what he was talking about was the phenomenon of the past 20 to 25 years of the unbundling of the corporation, or the unbundling of the value chain. And Ronald Coase won a Nobel Prize at the University of Chicago saying, why do firms exist? And he said they're a bundle of value-creating activities. What we've learned because of the incredible power of IT is corporations today and their corporate strategies can bundle, rebundle, unbundle, sell off this asset without shutting down the firm or selling the firm out in an IPO. And so as your committee starts to go down that rabbit hole of saying, not only do we want to regulate the entity, the corporate entity, which I do understand, when you start saying, well, I want to regulate the IP of the entity and maybe this mine of it, you're getting deep into the value chain and the corporate street and business strategic decision-making of individual corporations. First, I don't think that's your role as parliamentarians. And secondly, even if you decide it's your role, I think you're going to have hell on earth trying to become such a macro, micro regulator. You're getting deep into the corporate and business strategic decisions of what assets do we need to maximize value creation. And when you start getting down to there, I understand your motives and I understand your intent. I just think you're talking very large numbers of companies, and they're very complex and they're very sophisticated, and I think you're going to find it devilishly difficult.
Thank you. I mean, my opening remarks and subsequent answers to questions obviously raised the issue of what is, business activity, and in relation to material assets or material technical information. Certainly, as I mentioned at the outset, focusing on business activity and kind of separating to some extent from the assets and the technical information, I find is problematic in the current legislation or the bill, because in a way, if the focus to trigger a notification is a business activity and the acquisition of a business activity or an entity, then what happens, as I said, if a foreign investor buys the assets themselves directly or the information, right?
Sorry, I don't mean to be rude. It just I'm curious because you did mention that before, and the question that came to mind, and I guess I'm asking you to say the other side of the argument, which may be difficult for you, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts. Why do you think they chose the entity level as opposed to the asset level?
I think, look, I don't know. You would have to ask the drafters. I think part because this is how the Investment Canada Act is built, right? It's focused on the entity, on the business activity, not so much on assets. Except that now it's no longer about just an investor buying into a company or an enterprise, right? We're talking in terms of national security. Well, the enterprise itself is not the problem in terms of national security, is what do we do with those assets, or what could potentially a foreign investor do with those assets and threaten national security. And the same thing with the technical information.
That's a great segue, actually, because my other definitional issues with respect to national security, that's easy for a politician to write down those words. But as we've seen just recently with one of our own MPs being, family being threatened, the breadth of national security can be quite wide. For example, the predatory regime, if they get a lead in AI, that could be a national security issue for us going forward. And in fact, I would challenge Mr. Bruce. You said something about working with perhaps the regime in Beijing, and that if we give them if we give them access to our economy, we'll be friends with them, and maybe they'll. To me, that just strikes of naivete and dangerously so. And should we not be separating, or at least having some discussion, that there's a difference between the United States of America, a democracy that by and large lives by the rule of law, as opposed to authoritarian dictatorial regimes? I would open the floor to Mr. Bruce on that.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I didn't say friends. What I said was the engagement with China is something we will continue to do unless we sever all ties with them. As I indicated, we had a 17% growth in our bilateral trade with them last year. 17%. It's now at $100 billion. So we are engaging with China. So the question is, do you want to be in the driver's seat, or do you want to be driven by that relationship? And so I'm saying to you that we have got opportunities to continue engagement, and dialogue is important. People forget that during the coldest of the Cold War, 30% of Western Europe's energy needs were met by the USSR. When they were building a wall around Berlin, we were still talking to the USSR. So the fact that people want to completely cut off these countries, I think, is naive. I think what we need to do is be able to sit down and have conversations where it's appropriate to do so in our own national interest. And climate change is a good one. Health and life science, look at the work we did on COVID around the world. There are things we can work on together that have we mutually agree on the outcome. And I think that's what I was talking about.
Mr. LeBlanc, maybe I'll throw it back to you, just with respect to, like I said, the definition of national security isn't just arms that we might be selling to other countries or military. Do you share at all my concern that the defining national security could be incredibly broad? Like I think Mr. Bruce even brought up land. To a certain extent, if an authoritarian regime is buying large swaths of our farmland, that, to me, is also a national security concern. Do you share any of those concerns, or am I all wet on this one?
No, you're absolutely right. And I mean, national security can be defined very, very broadly. Ultimately, national security is whatever the government says it is, right? And we saw it certainly during the Trump administration, where all of a sudden tariffs were imposed on our steel and aluminium because of national security, where you might, from our point of view, we were no threat to the United States national security. On the contrary, but in the mind of Donald Trump, we were. Now, whether that was, obviously we can all agree that it was not national security. It was much more about protectionism. But yes, national security can be invoked for other purposes, and I think it is important to have again with transparency in mind. Obviously, national security takes many forms. I'm not sure that we can define it in a way that says, okay, well, this is national security, this is not, right? Giving the example of land, you say, okay, a foreign country buys all our agricultural land and decides that it wants to starve us and decides not to exploit those lands. Well, that's a national security issue. Now, if it exploits it now and then, exports it somewhere else, maybe too much to our liking to China, but then if the revenues are taxed here and then we can buy other stuff, you might say that's not a national. So, I mean, your question is correct, and it reflects the challenges. So in a way, to me, is that if there are decisions that are made on national security grounds, they have to be justified somehow to, at a minimum, to Parliament, right? Which ultimately is supposed to hold government to account.
I agree with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawrence and Mr. LeBlanc. Colleagues, I've spoken to you offline, but instead of going to a formal third round, given that it's already 6, I propose that we just open the floor to those of you who have questions. And given that Mr. Perkins has told me he has a pile of questions, I'll go to Mr. Lemire first. Monsieur Lemire.
Merci, monsieur.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start by pulling a Brian Mass and tabling. I'll start by pulling a Brian Mass and tabling a notice of motion that I intended to table at Heritage, that is to table before industry the motion that was tabled by Rachel Thomas from the Conservatives, which is that given the report tabled March 27 by the Auditor General entitled Progress when it comes to internet high-speed internet for rural, remote communities, First Nations, that the committee invite Karen Hogan to testify as soon as possible for at least 2 hours. Of course, the interpreter did not have this document. So the earliest time probably would not be until the fall, but I thought it would be useful for us to mention this in the context of our work, because the point raised by the Liberal member, Chris Bedell, was that it would be really more up to the industry committee to debate this issue, that it be part of our motions for discussion. That would be useful. So I'm tabling the motion without necessarily debating it, having it debated today. As to our witnesses, the issue of transparency remains. Mr. Lee, let's start with you. Foreign investment funds have to continue to do business, but the world situation can change for some countries. Some nations may become allies at some point and enemies at others, or non-allies at other points. Of course, the situation with China and Russia have evolved very quickly over the last 5 years alone. Should this change the way in which we agree to foreign investments? What options are open to us to receive these funds and also ensure national security? Does the law as it stands protect us vis-a-vis changes in hegemony in some other countries?
Thank you, Mr. Lemire. I was glad you asked that question because I'm obviously a lot older than you are, so I have memories going back to the Cold War. And why I'm bringing that up is I'm on this debate group about some friends of mine and academia and out in the business world are debating and saying that the US dollar is in decline as the foreign reserve currency. And yet, when you look back over the last 100 years, right up to today, I don't see big changes in our allies and our enemies. There was a bloc called the Warsaw Pact or the USSR and its satellites that worked under its own currency called ruble dominated, and they were, quote, the enemies. And there's a bloc emerging today. China is pushing this BRIC issued currency. And I added up just very quickly to answer your question. I went and looked up World Bank data is very easy to access. And I looked up the allies, the OECD countries that are really under the US, let's call it partnership or umbrella. And the GDP of these countries, I'm talking at the OECD, so it's 35, 36 countries, France, Germany, Italy, Canada. It's about 2/3, 65 trillion of the world GDP of 100 trillion. So the developed countries, and I'm not being ethnocentric because I've taught in many developing countries, but the developed countries, the high income countries, to use the World Bank classification, are 2/3 of the world. They're growing much more quickly. As the Economist cover story showed just last week, the United States is growing, outperforming everybody. And it seems to me that the coalition of partners is very stable all the way from 1917 and the Russian Revolution to today. It's just that China has, if you will, taken the place of the Soviet Union. But you have a very clear two blocks emerging again. And I don't disagree with Mr. Bruce. I'm not suggesting we should stop dealing with China. I'm saying we can deal with China, to put it simplistically and crudely, with low technology products, shipping them fish or wheat or barley. Whereas I understand the unbelievable concern and serious concern with much more sophisticated products where there are issues of technology that we don't want to transfer. So I think we can look at the world in that through that prism of two blocks. And there's the OECD block or the high income block or the US led block, if you want, whatever word we want. And there's another block led by China, but it's much smaller. It's only 1/3 of the world's GDP, dominate. And by the way, the lion's share of that is China itself. So I think we can, if you look at it through that lens, I think you can look at the national security. I know who the allies of Canada are. They're next door, the US and Germany and France and Italy and UK and so forth. So I don't spend a lot of, I don't worry about that because I have a clear idea. And I'm saying that as somebody who's taught in China for 25 years, year after year after year. And I love going there, wonderful people at the student level, but at the same time, it's a very different block with very different values, very different legal system. And so we do have a good sense of who are the two camps or the two blocks and what countries are in each one.
C'est important qu'on demeure.
It's important to be both rigid, flexible, and agile when it comes to Investment Canada Act. One of the ways of doing things would be to go through regulations, a list of regulations with respect to the protection of critical and strategic minerals. Do you get the feeling that the current list is complete? Is that the right way to go about protecting our investments in what is really the basis of the 21st century economy?
If you're asking me, I'll be very quick because I know the other two, I want to hear them. But I'm not worried about protecting critical minerals from the Germans or the Americans. I'm not. And so I keep saying that there's two animals in this bill. You know, there's the national security animal, which is very important. And I think that that's much more important. And you're going in the right direction, it seems to me. And on the net benefit, I think you're going in the wrong direction. You're trying to micromanage companies and foreign investment from reliable partners like the US or Switzerland or Germany or France, when we should have a lighter hand, less regulation, because that's where the lion's share of foreign direct investment is coming from. And I don't see them as a threat to national security, but people that are far more learned on national security may disagree with me on that.
Perhaps I'll ask the other two witnesses to answer before I hand over the floor to Mr. Perkins.
Sur la protection.
On the issue of the protection of our strategic critical minerals. Look, as far as I'm concerned, and I've already mentioned it, Do critical minerals represent a threat to national security? That's unclear. Would a mine belonging to Chinese interests versus German interests mean a threat to national security in one case and not the other? Not necessarily. A German company could easily decide to sell everything to Germany to produce electric vehicles in Germany alone, whereas a Chinese company could easily sell to whoever wants to pay most for these minerals. And the opposite is also possible in this case. The question is, what is the risk? What is the true threat? Is there a national security threat? Maybe not. Unless these minerals are then used for military purposes or equipment, then maybe there's an argument to be made there. But again, the issue is knowing who is the owner, or is there another way of saying, okay, first of all, you have to use it. You could purchase something and never actually use it. You could say if you don't, then you lose your investment. Then there might be other means that are not limited solely to say whether or not we are accepting this investment. There are foreign investors that are prepared to pay very good money for our assets. So can we afford to say no? The question is, why do they want to pay so much? And what are the risks economically? And what are the risks in terms of national security? But it's not necessarily the fact that it's Chinese, German, or American in and of itself that determines that level of risk. You have to have a more in-depth analysis and a bit more nuanced analysis. Mr. Bruce, do you have anything to add?
I think the only thing I would love to add is that supply chains are very integrated on a global scale. And while there'll be some resiliency and reshoring of certain supply chains around national interests, think about the iPhone, which many of you hold. It's built primarily by a Taiwanese company called Foxconn. They have 1 million employees in mainland China. So in fact, the phone is being made in China. Tesla's batteries for their vehicles, by and large, is made in mainland China because they have the capacity to scale and the technology to be able to do that. So I think you've got to look at a supply chain issue when it comes to certain outcomes that you're looking for and understand where all of that integration occurs. And I think we need to have a more mature, very methodical look at what these things look like, because we can't prescribe one action that we're going to cover all these other bases that we have. So I think flexibility and agility in the legislation is going to be key.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, witnesses. I think I'd like to take us away from the issue of trade, because this bill's not about trade, and we've had a lot of discussion here about trade. This bill is about when a foreign company buys a Canadian company. And the Investment Canada Act, which has existed and was replaced FIRA before that in the 80s, exists to deal with that issue. And so I'd like us to focus on my questions and responses on that issue. So I'll start. Dr. LeBlanc, the Investment Canada Act has a formula for when a foreign takeover allows the minister to actually start a review. Right now, this year, it's at $1.3 billion. So any foreign takeover of a Canadian company, not asset, more than $1.3 billion, then allows Investment Canada and the minister to take a look at it. There is nothing in the Investment Canada Act that compels them to do a national security view or a net benefit view. And how are we doing that? Because in the last few years, we've seen the takeover of the Tanko mine, which is a lithium-producing mine in Manitoba, by a large Chinese state-owned resources company. And it had no national security review. The minister of the day, Navdeep Bains, decided not to do a national security review. We know that Norsat, which owns Sinclair Technologies, Norsat was a Vancouver telecommunications company, Sinclair is a Toronto-based company, was acquired in 2019 by Hytera, which is a Chinese state-owned company. And again, the minister of the day chose not to do a national security review. So there's nothing in there that requires that. And earlier you mentioned that you thought it was automatic. It's not. Right now, that flexibility applies to a state-owned enterprise that acquires something that's over $415 million. So if it's under $415 million, of which China is buying a lot of assets in Canada under $400 million, in my part of the world, they're paying 5 times the price every quarter for at least 3 to 4 lobster buyers. I know it seems small, but they're paying $10 million for $2 million businesses. And they've bought the supply chain. They've bought the control of the freight forwarding company that exports all of that lobster out of Nova Scotia. So now if you're not a Chinese state-owned buyer in Nova Scotia, your lobster has to go to New York or Chicago to fly to Asia. And the Halifax Airport live lobster control is being now controlled by the freight forwarder owned by China. So there are supply chain issues here of takeovers that when you're before $415 million, there's an issue. And even over $415 million is no guarantee. So what I am suggesting is that the state-owned enterprise takeover needs to be automatic, that the minister doesn't get the option to choose not to do a national security review, which has happened quite frequently in the last few years. So I'd like your comments on that issue, please.
I mean, the example you gave about the lobster could have happened with a non-state-owned enterprise, right? To me, it sounds like it's ultimately it's a competition issue, right? You basically have a company that has bought a bunch of companies and taken control of the supply chain and now is managing it, somehow with a section of it in terms of a monopoly for its own benefit. So to me, again, it's not really a question of whether it's ownership or not. This is really behavior.
That was just one example.
Yeah, I understand. I mean,
that's a good point.
The issue, and I've said that in other instances, right? Sometimes the ownership itself is not the problem, is what are the risks associated with that ownership? I mean, obviously on national security ground, people would say, well, a state-owned enterprise that buys a lobster company or the freight forwarding is not really a national security, although maybe, in Nova Scotia it might be considered national security, and I respect that. But to me in this case, it seems to be much more of a competition issue. Now, whether the big question, as you mentioned in terms of SOEs or others, like obviously the thresholds create this kind of problem. If we think that SOEs are a problem, right? And again, what kinds of SOEs are we talking about? Then it's a little bit like the bill here, C-34. We think that, well, anything that might, in terms of either assets or information, technical information that might be a risk to national security, needs to be notified. And ultimately, the minister has to decide whether this flies or not, right? Now, if we think that state-owned enterprises in and of themselves are a menace to our economy, to our national security, well, then the same logic should apply. Any state-owned enterprise, regardless of where it's from in the world, should notify an acquisition to the minister, and the minister should then decide whether, this flies or not, and again, be able to justify, right? If there is a decision to not investigate or to allow the acquisition to go through. So maybe, again, if the risk is there, then why the threshold? Because you're absolutely right. You might say, well, we'll just buy below the threshold and end up exactly where we want to be. Right?
Thank you. Dr. Lee, a couple of questions for you, if I could.
Can I just respond to that, Veric?
Well,
say something?
Let me ask the question, and maybe you can build it into where we're going, because it's sort of linked.
Okay.
We've had a chat about the speed. A primary purpose of this bill is to make the process quicker, right?
Right.
I've sat around C-suites for 25 years as a business guy, and I know that I made brilliant decisions in the things I was responsible for, but I always had to bring them to the executive table for a discussion. And generally, as you know, as a business professor, you get better decisions out of the team scrutinizing that than you do out of one particular individual making the choice on their own. By the same token, what the current Investment Canada Act requires is that when the review either on net benefit or national security is done, the minister has to go to the Governor and Council, to the Cabinet, with a recommendation and get their judgment. And I've talked to a number of former ministers about those discussions that have happened on this. And they said, we got better decisions because you had a multitude of perspectives at the table. So I'm a little concerned about removing, which this bill does. It removes that part of it and leaves it solely to the minister. And like any executive, and like any minister, some are better than others. And,
Sure.
and that if you leave it solely to the minister, you lose the importance of that corporate executive decision-making process.
I agree with what you just said, that you're going to lose that, and more voices, are better than a single solitary voice. But the larger issue with SOEs, I've made a very similar argument for years that are similar to Jack Mintz. It's unfair competition. It's not a level playing field, everybody. They do not play by the rules. If they lose money, they go to the government and say, give me more money. It's the same problem I have with commercial crown corporations. Air Canada when it was still owned by the government, guess what? If they lost money, we give them more money. That's not competition. That's just going to your sugar daddy called the government of Canada and digging into the deep pocket of the taxpayer. But the whole point, if you believe in the level playing field and if you believe in the Competition Act of Canada and the Competition Tribunal, we want more competition on a level playing field, and any SOE, I don't care if it's Chinese or Canadian, or if it was British or French, they do not compete for capital. They do not compete for anything, because at the end of the day, if they need more, they go to the government that owns it and they get it from them. So that's the problem. All SOE transactions should be scrutinized.
So my last question, I agree, they have a different cost of capital, which is very important.
Yes.
On the industry list, the U.S., as you've said, is a very dynamic and open market for attracting foreign capital, and it's not just about the foreign direct investment rules. It's just also because of the size of their market. But they have a list, an industrial list, that says that they've identified certain segments like telecommunications as strategic. Now, it doesn't mean that it's regulated. It means it has to go through a review. It's not saying you can't do it. It just has to go through a review. This bill does not give the minister the authority to do that. I believe it should give the minister the authority to create a regulatory list of industries that the government thinks are strategic that should go to a review if they're bought there. Biotech may be one, that kind of thing. So I'd like your comments on that.
I agree with you. And by the way, if I can just put sidebar, the United States is as attractive as it is because it is seen, and you know this as a former CEO, as the risk-free rate of return in the world. In other words, and I've heard this when I was teaching in Russia, imagine, or in Ukraine, where I have taught, and in China. If you are a smart person and you have this brilliant new technology, where are you going to try to develop that new company and IPO? Is it in Mongolia? Is it in Russia? Are you dreaming? You want to go to Silicon Valley because you know the government is not going to expropriate you because they're not Putin, and they're not going to regulate you to death because it's America and cap.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lee. You're on mute, but that's convenient. And I was about to add, if you're a bank, they're going to bail you out. And so I'll just move to Mr. Gahir for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to get a question in before we conclude for the day. Just on Mr. Perkins' point, I think the regulatory list actually already exists in the guidelines on the National Security Review of Investments. So, but the regulatory lists do exist within the guidelines, right? But that's just slightly. But I wanted to, ask a slightly related question about lists themselves. This has been touched on a little bit in this committee, but we've heard suggestions that there should be a list or a guide of threatening state actors or authoritarian regimes included in the legislation. Now, my personal view is that would be too rigid because authoritarian regimes do evolve over time. But how could this impact Canada's reputation as a destination for foreign investment? Mr. Lee or Mr. Bruce?
So I'll start. I don't think anybody was suggesting that we list hostile state actors in the legislation. I think what we were thinking about was things like the precondition lists that are proposed as part of this bill that we're not sure what they're all going to what they're going to mean at the end of the day and what they actually mean. Some of the things we think that should be considered is things like sensitive technologies, where we provide more transparency to potential outside investors into this country so they know what processes they have to go through depending on what sector they're going to invest in. That's really the recommendation I would have. Thanks.
I can't add to that. I agree completely.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gahir.
Thank you.
So if there are no other questions, that concludes our 2 hours of committee for today. But before we adjourn, first I want to thank our witnesses. It's been very interesting. I think I speak on behalf of all members, say that that was an enlightening conversation. We appreciate you taking your time, and for some of you, at the very last minute. So we appreciate your presence here this afternoon.
Thank you.
Before we adjourn, though, members, il faut qu'on adopte les budgets.
We need to pass our budgets for C34 and C27. You receive the documentation through the clerk. Can I say that we have unanimous consent to pass these budgets? I see no opposition. Thank you. The budgets have passed. And now we can adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Merci aux interprètes.
Thank you to the interpreter.